When a flight attendant dismisses a black family and kicks them out of first class, she thinks she's putting them in their place. But when the plane lands, she discovers the shocking truth. They own the airline. What happens next will leave her questioning everything. Before we start the story, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Rebecca Collins had been working as a flight attendant for nearly 15 years. She had seen it all: grumpy passengers, last-minute requests, and delayed flights. She prided herself on keeping her composure, no matter how hectic the day got. Her reputation in the airline industry was one of professionalism. Skylux Airlines, where she worked, had built its name on providing an exclusive, high-end flying experience. The kind of service that made you feel like royalty, even in the air. Rebecca was a key part of that experience. She knew exactly how to manage the expectations of the wealthy, elite passengers who booked their first-class tickets, treating them like they were the only ones aboard. To Rebecca, this wasn't just a job, it was a lifestyle. That evening, as passengers began to board Flight 512 to Paris, Rebecca stood at the front, scanning the crowd with her usual air of authority. Her eyes lingered on each passenger as they approached the gate. She was already thinking about who would need extra attention, who might complain about the food, and who could potentially make her job harder. As she glanced over the crowd, her eyes fell upon a family that caught her attention. James and Camille Johnson, along with their 2 young children, stood confidently in line. They weren't flashy, but there was something about them that made Rebecca take notice. James wore a simple navy blue suit, and Camille had on a modest yet elegant dress, their children quiet and well-behaved beside them. From their appearance, they seemed like any other family who could afford first-class tickets. Yet, something about them unsettled Rebecca. As they approached the gate, Rebecca noticed that their boarding passes were first class, and yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that they didn't belong in the premium section. It wasn't their attire. No, that was perfect. It wasn't even the polite way they addressed her. It was something else. Something Rebecca couldn't quite put her finger on. Her instincts kicked in, and as the family reached the front, she asked them to step aside for a moment. "Is there a problem?" James asked, his voice calm, but there was an edge to it, like he was already sensing something was off. Rebecca didn't respond immediately. She scanned their tickets again. There was no mistake, but for some reason she felt an unexplainable urge to challenge them. "I'm afraid I'll need to confirm your reservation," she said, even though the system clearly showed their tickets were valid. "There seems to be some confusion," she added, giving a polite but forced smile. James and Camille exchanged a quick glance, but said nothing. They waited, patient but wary, as Rebecca stepped aside to speak with a supervisor. The seconds stretched into minutes, and the tension between them thickened. Passengers behind the family grew impatient, some whispering quietly about the delay. Finally, Rebecca returned, her smile colder than before. "You'll need to follow me," she said. But instead of leading them to the first-class section in the front of the plane, she directed them to the back, near the restrooms, far from the windows with the best views. It was a subtle, calculated move, one designed to send a clear message. Rebecca didn't believe this family was suited for the first-class experience she had worked so hard to curate. James remained silent. Camille held her children's hands, not reacting to the change in seating, though the unease was evident in her eyes. She had seen this kind of treatment before. But tonight, it wasn't about making a scene. It was about making it through this flight and getting to Paris. They settled into their seats, the flight began, and the plane climbed into the sky. Rebecca continued her rounds, greeting passengers, offering drinks and attending to their every need. But something in the back of her mind gnawed at her. There was something about this family, something about their presence that didn't sit right with her. She couldn't quite understand it, but she knew she needed to keep an eye on them. As the flight progressed, Rebecca found herself glancing toward the Johnson family more often than she intended. They were seated quietly, James reading a book, Camille helping one of the children color in a travel activity book. The younger child had fallen asleep, leaning on her mother's arm. There was nothing unusual about them, no loud voices, no unreasonable demands. If anything, they seemed more composed than many of the other first-class passengers Rebecca had served in the past. Yet she couldn't stop the nagging sense of irritation bubbling under the surface. Rebecca returned to the galley, where her co-worker, Melissa, was preparing drinks. Melissa was newer to the airline, still learning the ropes, but eager to please. "Everything okay out there?" Melissa asked as she placed a tray of champagne flutes on the counter. Rebecca hesitated for a moment, then decided to confide in her. "You saw that family in the last row of first class, right?" she asked, lowering her voice. Melissa glanced toward the section and nodded. "Yeah, they seem nice. What about them?" Rebecca leaned in, her tone sharper now. "Doesn't it feel off? I mean, first class isn't cheap and they're just, well, you know." She didn't finish her sentence, but her implication was clear. Melissa frowned slightly, unsure how to respond. "They have valid tickets, don't they?" she asked cautiously. Rebecca rolled her eyes. "Of course, but that doesn't mean anything these days. People game the system all the time. I've seen it before." Melissa didn't push further, but Rebecca's words hung in the air. Rebecca continued to stew, her frustration growing. She felt justified in her actions earlier at the boarding gate, convinced that her instincts about the family were correct. She started keeping a closer watch on them, looking for any sign of behavior that might confirm her suspicions. Meanwhile, James and Camille could sense the subtle tension around them. Camille, ever perceptive, noticed that their service was unusually slow. Other passengers had received their drinks and snacks promptly, but their row seemed to be overlooked. When they pressed the call button to request water for their daughter, it took an unusually long time for a flight attendant to respond. Camille said nothing, but James leaned closer to her, whispering, "They're watching us." Camille gave a small nod, her expression calm. "Let them," she whispered back. "We've dealt with worse." James sighed but didn't reply. Instead, he reached for his phone, checking his email briefly before setting it aside. He didn't want to make a scene, but he couldn't help but feel a growing frustration with the way they were being treated. This was supposed to be a relaxing, celebratory trip for their family, not an exercise in patience. Unbeknownst to Rebecca, one of the other passengers in first class was observing her behavior closely. A middle-aged man in a sharp suit, seated a few rows ahead of the Johnsons, had noticed the delays in their service, and the barely concealed annoyance in Rebecca's demeanor whenever she passed their row. He raised an eyebrow but said nothing, for now. As the flight continued, the tension in the air grew thicker. Rebecca tried to refocus on her tasks, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something about this family was challenging her authority in ways she couldn't articulate. For the first time in years, her usual sense of control felt shaky, and she didn't like it one bit. As the dinner service began, Rebecca deliberately delayed attending to the Johnson family's row. Other first-class passengers were enjoying their gourmet meals, sipping on fine wines and laughing softly over their conversations. Meanwhile, James and Camille waited patiently, their menus still untouched on the tray table. Camille glanced around discreetly, noticing how effortlessly the attendants catered to the other passengers. She leaned over to James and said quietly, "This isn't a coincidence." James sighed and leaned back in his seat, crossing his arms. "I know," he muttered. His voice carried a measured calm, but the frustration was evident in his eyes. "But let's not give her the satisfaction of seeing us upset." At last, Rebecca approached their row, her expression neutral, but her body language stiff. "I apologize for the delay," she said curtly, setting their menus down with a sharpness that was subtle but noticeable. "We've had a bit of a backlog in the galley." Can I take your order now? Camille smiled politely but didn't miss a beat. Yes, of course, she said, her tone unwavering. She and James placed their orders, speaking in the same calm, composed manner they had maintained since boarding. Rebecca jotted down their choices quickly and left without the usual warmth she reserved for other passengers. As the meal service dragged on, Rebecca's behavior didn't go unnoticed. The man in the sharp suit, now quietly sipping his whiskey, continued to observe the Johnsons and the lackluster service they were receiving. He seemed to weigh his thoughts carefully, deciding whether or not to intervene. Finally, when the meal was served, the Johnsons received their plates last. The delay was glaring, but Camille kept her head high, cutting into her dish with practiced ease. James offered a small smile to his wife, appreciating her grace in the face of such obvious disrespect. Their children remained quiet, as if sensing their parents' mood and mirroring their calmness. Midway through the meal, the man in the sharp suit couldn't stay silent any longer. He flagged down Melissa, who was passing by. "Excuse me," he said in a low but firm tone. "Can I ask why the family in the last row of first class was served so late? It's not hard to notice." Melissa froze for a moment, her eyes darting to Rebecca, who stood just a few feet away. Rebecca turned toward the man, her face tightening slightly. "I assure you, sir, everything is under control," she said quickly, trying to deflect the question. The man raised an eyebrow, unimpressed by her response. "Under control? It looks to me like there's a deliberate effort being made to ignore them. Do you think that's appropriate for passengers who paid for first-class service?" Rebecca's cheeks flushed slightly, but she forced a professional smile. "I'm sorry if it appeared that way, sir. That was not the intention." The man stared at her for a moment longer, his expression unreadable. Then, with a subtle shake of his head, he turned back to his meal, leaving Rebecca feeling more rattled than before. Melissa, looking uncomfortable, excused herself and retreated to the galley. As Rebecca tried to regain her composure, she stole another glance at the Johnson family. They weren't making a scene. They weren't complaining. Yet somehow their calm presence felt like a quiet rebuke, a challenge she wasn't prepared to face. For the first time that evening, Rebecca began to feel the faintest pang of unease. Something about this situation felt bigger than she had anticipated, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what it was. The rest of the dinner service passed uneventfully on the surface, but the tension continued to linger in the cabin. Rebecca tried to focus on her duties, moving quickly between the rows, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the man's pointed comment and the Johnson family's unwavering composure. Every interaction with them, no matter how routine, seemed to unsettle her more. They weren't confrontational, but their silence spoke volumes. Meanwhile, James exchanged a glance with Camille, silently acknowledging the growing unease in the cabin. Camille, ever the steadying presence, leaned in and whispered, "We've handled worse, remember? Let's just enjoy what we can." Her hand lightly brushed his arm, a small gesture of reassurance. James nodded, but his jaw remained tight. Rebecca, standing near the galley, overheard snippets of the passengers' murmurs. Though no one openly criticized her, the man's earlier comment had clearly sparked quiet conversations. Rebecca felt her control slipping, and with it came an uncharacteristic nervousness. She prided herself on maintaining professionalism and command in any situation. Why was this family getting under her skin? As the hours stretched on, the cabin lights dimmed for the night. Passengers began settling into their seats, some dozing off while others watched in-flight movies. The Johnson children had fallen asleep, their small heads resting on their parents' shoulders. James and Camille, however, remained alert, their quiet conversation punctuated by occasional glances toward the flight attendants. In the galley, Rebecca couldn't keep her frustrations bottled up any longer. She turned to Melissa and muttered, "I don't understand why they're acting so entitled. It's not like they're royalty." Her voice was low, but the bitterness was unmistakable. Melissa, visibly uncomfortable, hesitated before replying. "I don't think they're acting entitled," she said carefully. "They're just normal passengers. Maybe we should just treat them like everyone else." Rebecca shot her a sharp look. "You don't understand. I've been in this business long enough to know when something doesn't feel right." She didn't elaborate, but the words hung in the air. Melissa opened her mouth to respond, but thought better of it, retreating back to the cabin instead. Unbeknownst to Rebecca, James had quietly risen from his seat and made his way to the front of the plane, speaking briefly with the captain's assistant. His calm demeanor hadn't wavered, but there was a quiet intensity in his request. The assistant nodded and escorted James to the cockpit, where he had a brief and private conversation with the captain. When James returned to his seat, Camille raised an eyebrow, but didn't ask. She trusted her husband's judgment and knew that whatever he had planned would be handled with the same quiet dignity they had shown all evening. Rebecca, still oblivious to the conversation in the cockpit, continued her rounds. The other passengers in first class appeared relaxed, but there was a growing sense of awareness among them. Some were beginning to notice the subtle dynamics at play, the way Rebecca seemed to bristle whenever she approached the Johnsons. Whispers grew louder, though no one confronted her directly. As the plane sailed through the night sky, the cracks in Rebecca's carefully maintained facade began to show. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had underestimated this family, but she couldn't figure out why. The question gnawed at her, pulling her focus away from her duties. And while she busied herself trying to maintain control of the situation, the Johnsons remained calm, quietly observing the events unfolding around them. Something about their stillness was unnerving, and Rebecca had no idea just how much her actions were about to cost her. As the plane soared through the darkened skies, Rebecca's unease continued to grow. Every glance at the Johnson family seemed to unsettle her further. They weren't loud, they didn't demand anything, and yet their quiet presence felt like a challenge she couldn't ignore. Meanwhile, the cabin remained calm, most passengers either sleeping or quietly watching movies. It should have been a routine flight, but Rebecca could feel an invisible weight pressing down on her. In the first-class cabin, James adjusted his seat slightly, leaning closer to Camille. "Everything's set," he whispered. Camille looked at him, her expression unreadable, before giving him a small nod. She glanced at their children, still fast asleep, then back at her husband. "Are you sure this is necessary?" she asked softly. James gave a faint smile, the kind that carried both reassurance and resolve. "It's not about us anymore," he said. "It's about everyone who might go through this." Camille held his gaze for a moment before leaning back into her seat, her hand resting protectively on her daughter's. Meanwhile, in the galley, Rebecca found herself unable to shake a nagging sense of something she couldn't quite name. She had always trusted her instincts, and tonight was no different. But instead of clarity, her thoughts were clouded by frustration and confusion. Why did this family, who had done nothing outwardly wrong, bother her so much? She convinced herself it was simply because they were challenging her authority in subtle ways. The man's calmness, the woman's quiet grace. It all felt like an affront, though she couldn't explain why. As Rebecca filled out a routine report near the galley, the same passenger in the sharp suit, the one who had confronted her earlier, approached her. He held his glass of whiskey loosely in his hand, his expression sharp but calm. "Excuse me, miss," he said, his voice low enough not to disturb the sleeping passengers. Rebecca looked up, already bracing herself for another comment. "Yes, sir? Is there something I can assist you with?" The man tilted his head slightly, studying her. "You've worked for Skylux a long time, haven't you?" "Yes, I have," Rebecca replied, keeping her tone professional but curt. 15 years. Why do you ask?" The man smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Impressive," he said. Then you must know how important customer experience is to this airline. I assume the Johnson family in the back row paid the same premium price as the rest of us. Wouldn't you agree they deserve the same service? Rebecca's mouth tightened. She hated the way his words cut straight to the point. Of course, sir, she said, forcing a polite tone. All passengers are treated with equal care. Are they? He asked, raising an eyebrow. Because it doesn't look that way from where I'm sitting. Rebecca's hand clenched slightly around the edge of her clipboard. If there's a concern, I assure you it will be addressed. The man took a sip of his drink, his gaze never leaving hers. Good, he said evenly, because you never know who might be watching. With that, he turned and walked back to his seat, leaving Rebecca standing in the galley with a growing sense of dread. She felt as though she had just been warned, though she couldn't say why. Her thoughts raced, trying to piece together what he might have meant. Did he know the family? Were they someone important? Rebecca shook her head, trying to push the doubts aside. She had handled difficult passengers before, and she would handle this situation as well. But deep down, she couldn't ignore the uneasy feeling that had settled in her chest. Something about this flight was different, and she was starting to realize that she might not be the one in control after all. The hours dragged on, and Rebecca's nerves began to fray. Every time she looked at the Johnson family, they seemed so calm, so unbothered by the thinly veiled hostility she had shown. Their composure only added to her unease, making her feel as if they knew something she didn't. Her mind replayed the man's cryptic remark in the galley. You never know who might be watching. What had he meant, and why had he directed that comment toward her? As the plane began its gradual descent toward Paris, Rebecca tried to focus on the tasks at hand, collecting trash, assisting passengers preparing for landing, and ensuring the cabin was secure. But no matter how hard she tried to distract herself, her gaze kept drifting to the last row of first class. James and Camille had woken their children, who were now quietly staring out the window, captivated by the city lights far below. Camille was adjusting her daughter's blanket, while James checked something on his phone, his expression as calm and measured as ever. In the back of her mind, Rebecca couldn't shake the feeling that something big was coming. It wasn't just the Johnsons' quiet presence. It was the way some of the other passengers had started glancing their way, whispering amongst themselves. The tension in the air had shifted, and Rebecca felt as though she was standing on the edge of something she couldn't control. As the plane touched down on the tarmac, the passengers in first class began gathering their belongings, readying themselves to disembark. Rebecca noticed James slip his phone into his pocket before exchanging a quick glance with Camille. The look between them was subtle but deliberate, as if they had silently agreed on their next steps. Rebecca busied herself ensuring that the other passengers were ready to leave, but her ears remained attuned to any sign of movement from the Johnson family. Finally, the moment came. As the cabin doors opened, Rebecca moved toward the exit to bid farewell to the first-class passengers, her professional smile firmly in place. The passengers began filing out, thanking her and the rest of the crew for their service. The man in the sharp suit passed by her, giving her a long, pointed look, but saying nothing. When it was the Johnson family's turn, Rebecca stiffened slightly. James paused, looking her directly in the eye. "Thank you for the flight," he said in a tone so polite and measured that it made Rebecca's stomach tighten. Camille offered a similar courteous nod, her gaze steady and unreadable. Rebecca forced a smile and nodded back. "You're welcome," she said quickly, eager for them to move on. As they exited, James turned briefly to look back at the cabin, his expression thoughtful. Rebecca couldn't tell if it was a gesture of farewell or something else entirely. It left her feeling strangely exposed, as though the thin layer of control she had tried to maintain throughout the flight had been quietly stripped away. Moments after the last first-class passenger left, one of the flight attendants approached Rebecca with a puzzled expression. "The captain wants to see you in the cockpit," she said, her voice hushed. Rebecca's heart skipped a beat. "Now? What for?" she asked, trying to sound composed. "I don't know," the attendant replied, shrugging. "But he said it was urgent." Rebecca felt a jolt of panic but quickly smoothed her expression. She adjusted her uniform, took a deep breath, and headed toward the cockpit. She told herself it was probably a routine matter, something minor that could be resolved quickly. But as she walked through the empty first-class cabin, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was about the Johnson family, and that whatever was waiting for her in the cockpit would change everything. Rebecca stepped into the cockpit, the usual hum of the plane's systems filling the small, confined space. The captain, a composed and seasoned man named Captain Harris, was seated with the co-pilot beside him, both reviewing final landing procedures. As Rebecca entered, Captain Harris looked up, his expression unreadable. "You wanted to see me, Captain?" Rebecca asked, keeping her voice steady. She clasped her hands in front of her, attempting to maintain her usual professionalism. Captain Harris nodded toward the empty jump seat. "Take a seat, Rebecca." Her heart thudded as she sat, glancing nervously between the two men. "Is something wrong?" The captain exhaled deeply, folding his hands on the console in front of him. "Rebecca, we've received a message from corporate," he began, his voice calm but firm. "It concerns the passengers in row 1G and 1H. Rebecca's stomach dropped. She didn't respond immediately, her mind racing. What message? Why now? She had handled the situation discreetly, or so she thought. "The Johnson family," Captain Harris clarified, watching her reaction closely. "They're not just passengers, Rebecca. They're owners." Rebecca blinked, her mind struggling to process his words. "Owners?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Harris said, his tone sharpening slightly. "James and Camille Johnson are the majority stakeholders in Skylux Airlines. They recently acquired the company as part of their broader investment portfolio. This flight was one of their first incognito evaluations of staff performance, and from the reports I've been receiving, their experience wasn't exactly up to standard." Rebecca's breath caught. Her thoughts spiraled as the weight of his words hit her. Owners. The very family she had subtly discriminated against throughout the flight didn't just buy tickets, they owned the airline. A cold sweat broke out on her brow as she pieced together the implications of her actions. Every delay, every slight, every dismissive glance. It had all been noticed, not just by the Johnsons, but likely by the other passengers as well. "Captain," Rebecca started, her voice shaky. "I wasn't aware." "That's the problem," Harris interrupted, his tone cutting. "You weren't aware because you didn't bother to treat them with the same respect you showed other passengers. And now, I'm afraid this situation is out of my hands. The Johnsons have requested a meeting with you before leaving the airport." Rebecca's hands gripped the armrests of the seat, her knuckles white. "A meeting?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Captain, surely—" "It's not up for debate," Harris said firmly. "This is a corporate directive. I'd suggest you prepare yourself to explain your behavior." Rebecca sat frozen, her mind reeling. A meeting with the owners, people she had disrespected, judged, and dismissed without a second thought. The very foundation of her confidence, her authority, felt like it was crumbling beneath her. She opened her mouth to protest, but quickly realized there was no point. She wasn't in control anymore. Captain Harris stood, signaling that their conversation was over. "They're waiting in the VIP lounge," he said. "I'll escort you there personally. Let's get this over with." Rebecca rose slowly, her legs trembling beneath her. As she followed Harris out of the cockpit, the reality of the situation fully sank in. This wasn't just a reprimand. This was the kind of moment that could end her career, and she had no one to blame but herself. Rebecca followed Captain Harris down the jet bridge, her heart pounding with every step. The fluorescent lights above seemed harsher than usual, casting stark shadows that mirrored the dread pooling in her chest. She struggled to maintain her composure, but the whispers of the cabin crew, who had clearly caught wind of the situation, only deepened her discomfort. As they approached the VIP lounge, the glass doors slid open with a soft hiss. Rebecca's eyes immediately landed on James and Camille Johnson, seated in the plush armchairs of the private space. James was relaxed, his legs crossed, one arm draped casually over the chair. Camille sat upright, her posture graceful but commanding, her expression unreadable. Their children were absent, likely being attended to elsewhere, leaving the couple fully focused on what was about to unfold. Captain Harris gestured for Rebecca to step inside, but the weight of the moment kept her frozen in place for a second too long. "Go ahead," he said firmly, his tone leaving no room for hesitation. Rebecca finally stepped forward, her polished heels clicking against the marble floor. Her usual air of confidence had vanished, replaced by the overwhelming realization that she was about to answer to the very people she had judged and mistreated. She stood before them, suddenly hyper-aware of how small and powerless she felt. James glanced up, his expression calm but piercing. He nodded toward the chair across from him. "Have a seat," he said simply. Rebecca lowered herself into the chair, clasping her hands tightly in her lap to stop them from trembling. Camille leaned forward slightly, her gaze steady but unyielding. "Rebecca, is it?" she asked, her tone cool but polite. "Yes, ma'am," Rebecca replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She felt a flush of humiliation creeping up her neck, but she forced herself to meet Camille's gaze. James exchanged a brief glance with his wife before turning his attention back to Rebecca. "I'd like to start by asking you a simple question," he said, his voice measured. "Why do you think we're here?" Rebecca hesitated, swallowing hard. She wanted to deflect, to shift the conversation away from her actions, but she knew there was no escape. She started, her voice faltering. "I understand there were issues during the flight." James raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to continue. Rebecca fidgeted with the hem of her blazer. "I may have mishandled certain aspects of your service," she admitted, each word feeling like it was dragged from her throat. "Mishandled?" Camille repeated, her tone laced with incredulity. She exchanged another look with James, who exhaled deeply before leaning forward. "Rebecca," he said, his voice soft but firm, "this isn't about a delayed drink order or a less-than-ideal seat assignment. This is about respect, or in this case, the lack of it. Throughout that entire flight, you treated us as though we didn't belong. Am I wrong?" Rebecca opened her mouth to deny it, but stopped herself. There was no point in lying. They had seen through her actions, just as she had feared. "No, sir," she admitted quietly. "You're not wrong." Camille tilted her head slightly, her expression shifting from stern to something resembling disappointment. "Do you know how many times we've encountered this kind of treatment?" she asked, her voice calm but cutting. "We've worked hard to build a life where we don't have to justify our presence, but people like you still make us feel as though we're trespassing. Why is that?" Rebecca's throat tightened, and she couldn't muster a response. Camille's words cut deeper than she expected, forcing her to confront the unspoken biases she had buried beneath years of polished professionalism. James leaned back, his gaze unwavering. "This isn't just about us," he said. "It's about every passenger who's been made to feel less than because of someone else's prejudice. As owners, we have a responsibility to ensure that this kind of behavior doesn't exist on our airline. And after today, I'm not sure you belong here." Rebecca's eyes widened, panic flooding her chest. "Mr. Johnson, please," she stammered. "This was a mistake, a lapse in judgment. I've been with Skylux for 15 years. I'm good at my job. I can learn from this." James studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Camille, however, was less reserved. "You've been here for 15 years?" she said, her voice sharp. "But what have you learned in that time? Clearly not how to treat people with respect." Rebecca's heart sank further. The silence that followed was deafening, and she realized that no carefully chosen words or excuses would undo the damage she had caused. The control she had so carefully cultivated during the flight was gone, replaced by an unshakable truth. She had misjudged them, and now she was facing the consequences. James finally broke the silence. "We'll take this matter to corporate," he said calmly. "Your actions today will be reviewed, and a decision will be made about your future with Skylux. But understand this: your behavior is unacceptable, and it reflects poorly not just on you but on the entire company. That's something we can't ignore." Rebecca nodded, her hands trembling in her lap. She wanted to plead further to defend herself, but she knew it would only make things worse. Instead, she sat in silence, the weight of their words sinking in as the reality of her actions settled over her like a heavy fog. As Rebecca sat frozen in her chair, the gravity of the situation bore down on her. The Johnsons' words echoed in her mind, dismantling the fragile justifications she had clung to throughout the flight. She felt exposed, as though every unspoken thought, every subtle bias she had acted on, was laid bare for the world to see. For the first time in her 15 years with Skylux, she felt genuinely powerless. James leaned forward again, his calm demeanor unshaken. "Rebecca," he said, his voice carrying a weight that made her flinch slightly. "We're not here to humiliate you. This isn't about revenge or making a spectacle of what happened. This is about accountability." Rebecca nodded stiffly, unsure if she should respond. Her throat felt dry, and her thoughts scrambled for anything that could salvage her position. She started, her voice cracking. She cleared her throat and tried again. "I understand that my actions were inappropriate, and I'm deeply sorry for how I treated you and your family." Camille's gaze remained steady, her expression unreadable. "Sorry isn't enough, Rebecca," she said firmly. "Apologies don't undo the harm caused. What matters is what you choose to do moving forward. Words are easy. Change isn't." Rebecca swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the hem of her blazer. She wanted to protest, to insist that she wasn't the person they thought she was, but deep down she knew there was truth in Camille's words. She had let her biases dictate her actions, and now she was paying the price. James leaned back slightly, his tone softening but still firm. "Here's what's going to happen. Camille and I will be reporting this incident to corporate, and they will decide the next steps. Whether or not you stay with this airline is out of our hands. But know this: your behavior tonight has set a standard we can't ignore." Rebecca nodded mutely, feeling a hollow ache in her chest. She had spent her career climbing the ranks, priding herself on her professionalism, only to have it unravel in a single flight. Her silence stretched on, but the Johnsons didn't fill it. They simply waited, their calm, composed presence amplifying the weight of her guilt. Finally, Camille stood, adjusting her coat with a quiet elegance that only deepened Rebecca's shame. "We've said what we needed to," Camille said, her voice cool but resolute. "What happens next is up to you, Rebecca. Think carefully about how you carry this forward." James stood as well, extending his hand toward Rebecca. She hesitated for a moment before shaking it, his grip firm but measured. "Good luck," he said simply, his tone devoid of malice but filled with finality. As the Johnsons walked out of the lounge, Rebecca sat motionless, her mind a storm of regret and self-recrimination. The echoes of their footsteps faded, leaving her alone with her thoughts and the cold, hard truth. Her actions had brought her to this point, and there was no one to blame but herself. Captain Harris re-entered the lounge a moment later, his expression a mixture of professionalism and pity. "Rebecca," he said evenly, "corporate will contact you in the morning. For now, I suggest you take the rest of the week to reflect on this. Rebecca nodded silently, rising to her feet. As she left the lounge, the reality of the situation hit her with full force. Her career, her reputation, everything she had worked for was now on the line. And it was all because she had let her prejudices dictate her actions. The pristine world she had built for herself suddenly felt fragile, teetering on the edge of collapse. Rebecca walked through the bustling airport terminal, her steps heavy and unsteady. The usual buzz of travelers, families reuniting, professionals rushing to their gates, announcements echoing overhead, felt distant, like static noise in the background of her thoughts. Her mind replayed the Johnsons' words over and over, each one cutting deeper than the last. The weight of their calm, deliberate confrontation felt heavier than any shouting match could have. She reached the employee parking lot and climbed into her car, gripping the steering wheel as if it were the only thing keeping her anchored. For a moment, she just sat there, staring blankly at the dashboard, her thoughts a chaotic mess. The Johnsons' faces, calm, composed, yet filled with quiet disappointment, floated in her mind. She wanted to be angry, to blame them for her predicament, but she couldn't. She knew that every choice she had made during that flight had led to this. The drive home was a blur, the city lights streaming past her windows like faint streaks. She barely registered the turns, her body moving on autopilot while her mind spiraled deeper into self-reflection. It wasn't just about this one incident, she realized. There had been other moments, smaller ones she had brushed aside or justified, where her actions might have been influenced by biases she had refused to acknowledge. The Johnsons had simply been the first to call her out on it so openly, forcing her to confront what she had ignored for years. When she finally pulled into her driveway, the house felt colder and emptier than usual. Rebecca sat in her car for a long moment, unable to bring herself to go inside. She knew that the quiet of her home would only amplify the storm in her head. Eventually, she gathered herself and walked inside, her heels clicking softly on the hardwood floor. She dropped her bag by the door and collapsed onto the couch, staring at the ceiling as the reality of her situation settled over her. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, pulling her out of her daze. She hesitated before picking it up, dreading what awaited her. It was an email from Skylux's corporate office. The subject line read, "Immediate review of employee conduct, Rebecca Collins." Rebecca's stomach tightened as she opened the email. The message was brief but clear. It confirmed that the Johnsons had filed an official report and outlined the steps that would follow. A meeting with HR, a formal review of her behavior on the flight, and a temporary suspension pending the outcome. There was no mention of termination, but the possibility loomed heavily between the lines. She set the phone down with trembling hands, her mind racing. Her career, 15 years of dedication, of carefully building her reputation, was on the verge of collapse. And yet, deep down, a small voice whispered that this wasn't just about the job. It was about something far bigger, something she hadn't allowed herself to confront until now. Rebecca leaned forward, burying her face in her hands. She had spent years believing she was above reproach, that her professionalism shielded her from the consequences of her biases. But the Johnsons had torn through that illusion with quiet precision, forcing her to see herself in a way she never had before. And now, for the first time, she didn't know how to move forward. The next morning, Rebecca woke up early, her sleep restless and filled with fragmented dreams of the flight. The email from corporate had been the first thing on her mind as she opened her eyes, a heavy reminder of the day ahead. As she sat with her coffee, staring at the email again on her phone, a part of her hoped it was all some misunderstanding that would blow over. But she knew better. She spent the morning replaying every interaction with the Johnsons, trying to identify the exact moment when everything had gone wrong. The truth, however, was harder to face. It wasn't just one moment. It was a series of choices, subtle and calculated, born from prejudices she had refused to acknowledge. She had never seen herself as someone who discriminated, but her actions spoke louder than her intentions ever could. As the hours passed, the fear of losing her job began to mix with something deeper: shame. Rebecca wasn't just afraid of the consequences. She was beginning to realize how deeply her behavior had betrayed the values she thought she upheld. She remembered Camille's sharp words from the lounge. "What have you learned in 15 years?" The question haunted her, a reminder that her professionalism had been a hollow facade. When the time came for her meeting with HR, Rebecca dressed carefully, choosing an outfit that projected competence and seriousness. As she drove to the Skylux headquarters, the city seemed unusually cold and gray, mirroring the dread settling in her chest. The journey felt endless, and by the time she arrived, she was almost numb. The receptionist at corporate directed her to a small conference room, where a representative from HR and a senior manager from the airline were waiting. Rebecca's heart raced as she entered the room, but she forced herself to maintain a neutral expression. The manager, a no-nonsense woman named Evelyn Moore, gestured for Rebecca to sit. "We're here to address the incident on Flight 512, Evelyn began, her tone professional but firm. "The Johnsons, as majority stakeholders, have filed a formal complaint regarding your conduct. They've detailed specific concerns about how you handled their service." Rebecca nodded, her throat dry. She wanted to speak to defend herself, but Evelyn held up a hand to stop her. "We'll give you an opportunity to respond," Evelyn continued. "But first, I want to be clear. This is not a minor issue. The Johnsons' complaint isn't just about poor service, it's about behavior that reflects systemic bias. That's something we take very seriously at Skylux." The HR representative, a younger man who seemed more uncomfortable than angry, nodded in agreement. "This isn't just about the Johnsons as individuals," he added. "They've highlighted concerns about how this could impact the company's reputation and culture." Rebecca swallowed hard, feeling the weight of their words. This wasn't just about her anymore. Her actions had cast a shadow over the entire airline, a brand built on the promise of luxury and inclusivity. When Evelyn gestured for Rebecca to speak, she took a deep breath, trying to steady her voice. "I understand the seriousness of the situation," she began carefully, "and I take full responsibility for my actions on that flight. I didn't treat Mr. and Mrs. Johnson with the respect they deserved. I allowed my own assumptions to affect my behavior." Her admission hung in the air, and for a moment, the room was silent. Rebecca felt a flicker of hope that her honesty might count for something, but Evelyn's expression didn't soften. "What assumptions are you referring to?" Evelyn asked pointedly, leaning forward slightly. Rebecca hesitated. She knew the answer, but saying it out loud felt like stepping into a void. "I assumed they didn't belong in first class," she admitted quietly, her voice almost breaking. "I let that assumption influence how I treated them." Evelyn's gaze didn't waver. "Do you understand why that's unacceptable, not just on a personal level, but as a representative of this company?" "Yes," Rebecca said quickly. "I do. And I'm truly sorry. I know an apology doesn't erase what I did, but I'm committed to learning from this and making changes." The HR representative scribbled notes on a clipboard, while Evelyn exchanged a glance with him. Rebecca's heart sank further. She could tell that her words, while sincere, might not be enough to undo the damage. Evelyn leaned back, her expression still stern. "Rebecca, your years of service with Skylux have been exemplary until now. But this incident is not something we can overlook. The Johnsons have every right to expect fair treatment, and their experience reflects poorly on the airline. This isn't just about you, it's about the culture we want to foster." Rebecca nodded, feeling the sting of tears she refused to shed. She had prided herself on her professionalism for so long, but now it felt like nothing more than a shield she had used to hide from her own flaws. "We will review this matter thoroughly before making a final decision," Evelyn continued. "For now, You are suspended with pay pending the outcome. You'll be notified of our decision within the week." Rebecca thanked them quietly, her voice barely audible. As she left the conference room, the weight of the suspension pressed down on her. Her career hung in the balance, but more than that, she was beginning to realize that her life as she had known it would never be the same. The days following Rebecca's suspension felt like an eternity. Her usual routine, waking early, donning her crisp uniform, and stepping onto the plane with a sense of purpose, was gone, leaving a hollow void in its place. Each day stretched endlessly as she waited for an update from Skylux Corporate. She replayed the flight over and over in her mind, trying to figure out if there was a single moment she could have changed to prevent the spiral of events. But no matter how much she analyzed it, the answer was always the same. It wasn't a single moment. It was every choice she had made, every bias she had allowed to guide her actions. Her phone became both her lifeline and her tormentor. Every time it buzzed, her heart jumped, only to sink when the notification wasn't from Skylux. The silence from the airline was unbearable, a constant reminder of the uncertainty looming over her future. She avoided calls from friends and family, unwilling to explain why she wasn't working. The shame of admitting her suspension kept her isolated, trapped with her thoughts. On the third day, an unexpected email broke the monotony. It wasn't from corporate or HR, but from a coworker, Melissa. The subject line read, "Are you okay?" Rebecca hesitated before opening it, unsure if she wanted to hear from anyone connected to the flight. The email was brief but sincere. "Hi, Rebecca. I just wanted to check in. I know things got tense on the flight, and I heard about your suspension. I hope you're holding up okay. Let me know if you want to talk." Rebecca stared at the screen, her emotions conflicted. Melissa had been the closest witness to what had happened, and though she hadn't said much during the flight, Rebecca could tell she had disapproved. Still, the email felt genuine, and for the first time in days, Rebecca felt a small spark of connection. She typed out a quick reply. "Thanks for checking in. It's been a rough week. Maybe we can talk soon." She hit send and set the phone down, realizing how lonely she had felt. The walls of her apartment seemed to close in tighter, the weight of her suspension pressing heavier with each passing moment. That evening, Rebecca decided to leave her apartment for the first time since her suspension. She needed air, space, something to distract her from the oppressive silence. She wandered aimlessly through the city, eventually finding herself in a quiet coffee shop tucked away from the main streets. She ordered a drink and chose a seat in the corner, hoping the noise of the cafe would drown out her thoughts. As she sipped her coffee, her mind drifted back to the Johnsons. She thought about their calm, unshakable composure and the quiet strength they had displayed throughout the flight. Camille's words, sharp yet measured, still echoed in her mind. "What have you learned in 15 years?" Rebecca had no answer then, and she wasn't sure she had one now. Her gaze fell on a group of young professionals seated nearby, their laughter and easy conversation a stark contrast to her own turmoil. For a fleeting moment, she envied their carefree demeanor. But then, one of their comments caught her attention. "I read about the Skylux thing," a woman said, leaning forward conspiratorially. "The owners were on a flight and the crew totally screwed up. Can you imagine?" Rebecca froze, her coffee cup halfway to her lips. Another person chimed in. "Yeah, I saw something about it online. Apparently the owners are this super successful black couple, and the staff didn't know who they were. Pretty embarrassing for the airline." The woman shook her head, laughing softly. "Talk about karma. You can't treat people like that and expect it not to bite you." Rebecca felt her stomach twist. She hadn't realized how far the story had spread. Hearing it from strangers only made it more real, more inescapable. She set her cup down, her appetite for coffee gone, and stared at the table. Her thoughts churned. If people were already talking about the incident, what would happen if she lost her job? Would her name become part of the narrative? The idea of being publicly associated with this mistake sent a fresh wave of anxiety through her. Rebecca left the coffee shop in a daze, the conversation playing on repeat in her mind. She realized she wasn't just fighting for her career anymore. She was fighting to preserve the identity she had built for herself. And for the first time, she wondered if that identity was worth holding on to at all. The following morning, Rebecca awoke to an email from Skylux Corporate. Her breath hitched as she opened it, scanning the message quickly. The subject line read, "Decision regarding suspension, Rebecca Collins." Her stomach churned as she read the first few lines. "Dear Ms. Collins, following a thorough review of the incident on Flight 512 and consultation with the airline's leadership team, including our stakeholders, we have reached a decision regarding your employment with Skylux Airlines." Her eyes skimmed down, heart pounding. Then the word struck her like a blow. "Your employment with Skylux Airlines will be terminated effective immediately." Rebecca reread the line several times, as though the words might change if she stared at them long enough. But they didn't. The email continued, detailing the reasons for the decision: violation of company policies regarding inclusivity, failure to uphold the airline's standards, and the potential damage to its reputation. It ended with a curt note about her severance package and instructions for returning her uniform and credentials. She dropped the phone onto the table, her hands trembling. It was done. The career she had spent 15 years building was gone in an instant. She sat in stunned silence, the enormity of it washing over her. The fear of this moment had consumed her for days, but now that it had arrived, it didn't feel real. It felt like the ground beneath her had vanished, leaving her suspended in a void. Her first instinct was to call someone, anyone, but she hesitated. Who would understand? Her co-workers would see her as a cautionary tale, a reminder of what could happen if they crossed the line. Her family would likely be supportive, but they wouldn't grasp the full scope of what this meant to her. And she didn't have many friends outside of work. Her life had revolved around Skylux for so long that it was hard to imagine anything else. Tears burned at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. This was her doing. She knew that. But the weight of accountability felt unbearable. What now? How could she move forward when her entire identity was tied to the career she had just lost? Rebecca stood abruptly, pacing her small apartment. She felt the walls closing in again, the silence growing louder by the second. Her mind raced with questions she couldn't answer. How would she rebuild? Could she? And perhaps the hardest question of all, had she truly learned anything? Or was this just another failure she would carry with her? The weight of the termination letter stayed with Rebecca like a shadow. For days, she avoided looking at her email, ignored her phone, and stayed locked inside her apartment. The silence wasn't comforting, it was suffocating. Yet she couldn't bring herself to face the world. It felt as though everyone knew, as though her failure was written across her face for strangers to read. On the fifth day, her doorbell rang. Startled, she hesitated before peeking through the peephole. It was Melissa. Rebecca hesitated, unsure if she wanted to see anyone, but eventually she opened the door. Melissa gave her a tentative smile. "Hey," she said softly. "I know you've been going through a lot, so I brought you something." She held up a paper bag, the logo of a local bakery stamped on the side. "It's not much, but I figured you could use something sweet." Rebecca stepped aside, letting her in. "Thanks," she murmured, her voice hoarse from days of disuse. They sat at Rebecca's small kitchen table, the bakery bag between them. Melissa broke the silence. "I heard about the termination," she said gently. "I'm really sorry, Rebecca. I know this must be a lot to handle." Rebecca exhaled shakily, her hands fidgeting with the edge of the table. "It's not like I didn't see it coming," she said quietly. "I made my choices, and now I'm paying for them." Melissa nodded, her expression compassionate. "I get that," she said. "But You're not the only one who's ever made a mistake. You're just in a situation where it was impossible to hide from the consequences." Rebecca looked up, her eyes searching Melissa's face. "Do you think I'm a bad person?" she asked suddenly, her voice cracking. "Because of what I did?" Melissa paused, considering her words carefully. "I don't think you're a bad person, Rebecca," she said. "I think you've been carrying biases you didn't even realize you had, and when they got challenged, you acted in a way that hurt people. But recognizing that's the first step toward being better." Rebecca blinked, her throat tightening. "What if it's too late?" she whispered. "What if I've ruined everything?" "It's not too late," Melissa said firmly. "You lost your job, yes, but you didn't lose your ability to learn, to grow, to change. The question is, are you willing to do the hard work to make that happen?" The words hung in the air, heavy but not crushing. For the first time since her termination, Rebecca felt a small flicker of hope. Not because the situation had magically resolved, but because she realized she still had a choice. The road ahead was uncertain and full of challenges, but perhaps it wasn't the end. Perhaps it was the beginning of something different, something better. She just didn't know what it looked like yet. Rebecca sat at the table long after Melissa had left, the bakery bag untouched beside her. The quiet advice Melissa had given echoed in her mind, challenging her to step out of the fog she had been drowning in. The question is, are you willing to do the hard work? It was a simple question, but the answer felt monumental. Could she truly confront the person she had been and find a way forward? The idea of change terrified her. She had spent so many years building her identity as a professional, confident, composed, untouchable. The cracks in that identity, exposed so brutally by the Johnsons, left her unsure of who she was without it. But what terrified her more was the thought of staying the same, of letting this moment define her as the woman who failed and never tried to fix it. For the first time in days, Rebecca turned on her laptop. She stared at the blank search bar, unsure where to start. Slowly, she began typing, "Unconscious bias and discrimination in the workplace." The search results flooded in. Articles, studies, training programs, personal essays. She clicked on one, then another, and soon she was immersed in stories of people who had recognized their own biases and worked to overcome them. Each story was different, but one common thread ran through them. Change wasn't easy, but it was possible. Rebecca found herself scrolling through forums and discussion boards, reading the candid experiences of people from all walks of life. Some were grappling with their own biases, while others shared the pain of being on the receiving end of discrimination. One post in particular caught her attention, written by a woman who had faced prejudice in her career and decided to take her experience and turn it into a force for good. She had started an organization aimed at fostering inclusivity and accountability in workplaces. The words resonated deeply with Rebecca. She thought about Camille Johnson, sitting across from her in the lounge, asking a question that still haunted her. "What have you learned in 15 years?" Rebecca realized she didn't have a good answer then, but maybe she could start finding one now. She bookmarked several articles and training resources, her fingers trembling slightly. For the first time, she considered reaching out to a professional organization for help, something she would have scoffed at in the past. But now, the idea of learning from others felt less like a concession and more like a necessity. Rebecca wasn't naive. She knew this wasn't a quick fix. Undoing years of ingrained attitudes and behaviors would take time and effort. But the alternative, remaining the person who had failed so profoundly, was no longer acceptable. The next morning, she woke with a strange mix of dread and determination. She knew what she needed to do. She picked up her phone and stared at the number she had saved years ago. Her younger sister, Leah. They hadn't spoken in months, their relationship strained by Rebecca's rigid and often dismissive attitude. Leah had spent years working as a diversity and inclusion consultant, but Rebecca had never taken her work seriously. Now it was Leah she needed to hear from most. Rebecca hesitated, her thumb hovering over the call button. Would Leah even want to hear from her after all this time? But as Melissa's words replayed in her mind, "You didn't lose your ability to learn, to grow, to change." She pressed the button and held the phone to her ear. It rang twice before Leah answered, her voice cautious. "Rebecca?" "This is a surprise." Rebecca took a deep breath. "Hi, Leah. I know it's been a while. I need to talk to you, if you're willing to listen." There was a pause and Rebecca braced herself for rejection. But Leah's voice softened. "I'm listening." Rebecca didn't hold back. For the first time, she let herself be vulnerable, admitting the mistakes she had made, the biases she hadn't acknowledged, and the consequences that had shattered her career. She didn't try to excuse herself or shift blame. She simply told the truth. When she finished, Leah was quiet for a moment. "Rebecca," she said finally, "it takes courage to admit what you just did. Most people don't even get to that point. But you need to understand that this isn't about fixing one moment. It's about unlearning years of behavior and committing to real change. That's a long road." "I know," Rebecca said, her voice steady but raw. "But I don't want to be the person I was. I don't want to keep making the same mistakes." Leah sighed, and Rebecca could almost hear the shift in her tone, the cautious hope. "If you're serious about this, I can help, but it's going to take work. Are you ready for that?" Rebecca's chest tightened, but for the first time, it wasn't fear. It was something closer to resolve. "I'm ready," she said, and for the first time in weeks, she believed it. Leah began outlining steps Rebecca could take, resources to explore, courses to enroll in, and conversations to have with herself and others. Rebecca listened intently, jotting down notes, already envisioning a different version of herself, one that wasn't defined by mistakes, but by the effort to correct them. It wasn't redemption yet, but it was a start. Months passed and Rebecca's life looked completely different. The woman who had once stood so firmly in her self-assured authority was now navigating a world of self-discovery, accountability, and growth. It wasn't easy, far from it. Every step along the way forced her to confront parts of herself she had spent years ignoring. But with Leah's guidance and a determination she hadn't known she possessed, Rebecca began the hard work of rebuilding herself. She started small, taking an online course on unconscious bias and how it manifests in professional environments. At first, the lessons stung, holding a mirror to the attitudes and assumptions she had carried for years. But instead of retreating, Rebecca leaned in. She read articles, attended webinars, and even joined a local discussion group that focused on creating inclusive communities. For the first time, she was listening to voices she had once dismissed, and their stories shifted her perspective in ways she hadn't anticipated. One day, as she was flipping through her notes from a seminar, Rebecca came across the contact information for a nonprofit organization that focused on workplace equity. She hesitated before dialing the number, unsure of what she could offer. But when the director picked up, Rebecca explained her situation honestly. Her years in the airline industry, the mistakes she had made, and her desire to contribute to meaningful change. To her surprise, the director was open and encouraging. "People who are willing to own their mistakes and learn from them are exactly the kind of allies we need," they said. "Why don't you come by next week? Let's talk." That meeting marked the beginning of Rebecca's second chapter. She started volunteering with the nonprofit, using her experience in the airline industry to help develop training programs for businesses. Her role was small at first, but as she grew more confident, she took on larger responsibilities, speaking at workshops, mentoring younger professionals, and even helping to draft policies aimed at promoting equity in the workplace. The transformation wasn't just professional. Rebecca reached out to people she had distanced herself from over the years, including Melissa. They met for coffee one afternoon, and Rebecca apologized sincerely for the way she had handled their dynamic on the flight. Melissa, ever kind, smiled and said, "I knew there was more to you than what I saw that day. I'm glad you're proving me right." Even the Johnsons stayed in her thoughts, their calm strength serving as a silent guide for how she approached her new life. One day, Rebecca wrote them a letter. She wasn't sure if they would ever read it, but she felt compelled to put her gratitude and apology into words. In the letter, she thanked them for forcing her to confront the parts of herself she had ignored for too long. "Your actions changed my life," she wrote. "Not just by holding me accountable, but by showing me that it's never too late to do better." As Rebecca mailed the letter, she felt a quiet sense of closure. She didn't know if the Johnsons would respond, but she no longer needed them to. The act of writing the letter was enough, a final step in taking responsibility and moving forward. Years later, Rebecca stood in front of a packed room at a workplace equity seminar. She was no longer the flight attendant who had let her biases dictate her actions. She was someone new, someone who had taken her failure and turned it into a foundation for growth. As she shared her story with the audience, she noticed the way they listened, not with judgment, but with hope. And as the seminar ended, Rebecca looked out over the room, realizing she had finally found her answer to Camille Johnson's question. What had she learned in 15 years? More than she ever imagined. And it was only the beginning. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to give it a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this.